It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls one aide tried to dismiss as routine household chatter. But the look on Princess Catherine's face as she left that private briefing said everything the palace would not. Something had been decided without William, and this time, it involved Camilla, Anne, and the future place of the Wales children inside the royal order. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Reports suggest Catherine had walked into that private briefing expecting another careful conversation about schedules, ceremonial duties, and the delicate rhythm of palace life while King Charles continued to carry the burden of illness and kingship at the same time. But what she allegedly heard was not routine. It was not a harmless domestic update. It was a decision, already moving through the palace machinery, that appeared to widen access for Camilla's private family circle. During moments traditionally guarded for working royals, direct heirs, and those bound by service to the crown. At first, aides reportedly softened the language. They called it domestic diplomacy. They called it family inclusion. They called it a gesture of warmth during a fragile reign. But behind those gentle words, insiders whispered something far sharper. That Camilla's household had crossed a line William believed should never have been touched, because this was not simply about who entered a room, who received an invitation, or who stood near the center of a royal gathering. It was about symbolism. It was about inheritance. It was about the quiet map of power that tells the nation who carries the future and who merely stands near it. And for William, the most painful part was said to be the way the decision brushed against the future place of George, Charlotte, and Louis, especially Charlotte, whose ceremonial path has always carried a silent emotional weight for Catherine. Sources suggest Catherine left the meeting shaken not because of one name on one list, but because she understood what William would understand the moment he heard it. Once private privilege enters royal protocol, it rarely leaves quietly. Princess Anne reportedly saw it even more coldly. To her, this was not kindness. It was precedent. And precedent inside the House of Windsor can become a weapon wrapped in velvet. Anne, shaped by Queen Elizabeth's iron discipline, is said to have viewed the move as a breach of the old boundary between the sacred institution and the private household. The crown, in her world, was never meant to bend around personal comfort. It was meant to stand above it. That is why the mood shifted so quickly from concern to fury, from whispers to warnings, from family discomfort to institutional alarm. William was blindsided. Catherine was unsettled. Anne was watching. And somewhere inside the palace, as Charles's weakened reign left gaps others seemed eager to fill. One quiet decision began to look like the opening move in a much larger struggle over who truly controls the monarchy's future. But the chilling truth wasn't just about one guest list, it was about a palace decision that threatened to redraw the royal family from the inside. The decision, insiders whisper, sounded harmless at first. A private adjustment, a family courtesy, a quiet reshuffling of access inside palace life. But behind those polished words sat something far more explosive. Camilla had allegedly moved to give her own circle a stronger presence at royal gatherings once reserved for bloodline heirs, working royals, and those bound by duty rather than proximity. Reports suggest the arrangement began quietly, not with a grand announcement, but through the soft machinery of palace administration, where one invitation becomes two, one private courtesy becomes a repeated privilege, and one exception begins to look dangerously like a new rule. Camilla's office, according to whispers moving through senior corridors, had approved an informal access pattern that allowed members of her private family circle to appear closer to royal life than many inside Kensington Palace believed was wise. Restricted receptions, family rooms, legacy-linked occasions, these were not ordinary spaces in William's eyes. They were symbolic ground. They carried the invisible weight of rank, sacrifice, and national expectation. And that is why what Camilla may have seen as warmth was allegedly received by William as a warning. To him, the line between the crown and a private household was not decorative. It was sacred. Once blurred, it could confuse the public, weaken the Wales children's future position, and turn monarchy into something dangerously personal. Princess Anne reportedly understood the threat with even colder clarity. She had spent a lifetime watching Queen Elizabeth defend the firm from emotional disorder, personal entitlement, and the quiet chaos of people wanting royal privilege without royal burden. So when aides began whispering about the Parker Bowles faction, It was not said as gossip alone. It sounded like a signal, a warning that the palace was no longer simply managing family harmony, but protecting the monarchy from a slow internal rearrangement. Staff reportedly grew uneasy because decisions of this nature usually passed through strict protocol, senior working royals, and careful consultation. But Charles's illness had changed the atmosphere. His reduced stamina, his divided attention, and the emotional pressure surrounding his reign created a fragile opening where domestic choices could carry constitutional weight. That timing made everything feel sharper, heavier, more dangerous. Camilla's supporters may have argued that she was only seeking inclusion, that after years of loyalty beside Charles, her family should not be treated like strangers at the edge of royal life. But William and Anne allegedly saw something else. Entirely. They saw a private circle moving closer to the machinery of legacy. They saw old rules being softened at the exact moment the crown needed discipline most. They saw, in one polished decision, the beginning of a precedent that could outlive the excuse used to create it. And as the quiet anger spread from Kensington to the old guard, the issue stopped being about access and became about survival. Who protects the monarchy when the king is vulnerable? Who has the right to shape its future? And who must be stopped before a courtesy becomes a claim? But once William saw what had been approved, the fury moved from private shock to something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. William did not explode in public. That was never his way. But according to palace whispers, the heir's anger hardened behind closed doors, where the language changed from family disappointment to constitutional alarm. This was not about Camilla inviting relatives for tea. It was about whether the monarchy could be quietly repurposed around personal loyalty while the king was too fragile to resist. Reports suggest William wanted answers immediately. Who approved the arrangement, who moved it through the system, and why the heir to the throne had been left outside a decision that touched the future image of the crown. His frustration was not theatrical. It was colder than that, more dangerous. The kind of anger that does not need volume because every word lands like a warning. For William, the issue reached straight into the heart of what he and Catherine had spent years protecting. The position of George, Charlotte, and Louis inside a monarchy already under pressure from scandal, illness, and public doubt. Catherine's earlier reaction reportedly gave the matter an emotional force William could not ignore, especially because Charlotte's future ceremonial visibility has become one of those delicate subjects the palace handles with extreme care. Any sign that private family politics might crowd the Wales children's place in the royal story would not be treated as a social misunderstanding. It would be treated as a threat. And that is where William's concern reportedly sharpened into something close to alarm. He feared that the public, already suspicious of privilege, might begin seeing the monarchy not as a national institution held in trust, but as a blended family network where access could be extended through affection, convenience, or influence. That fear was devastating because it struck at the very promise William has tried to build around his own future reign: discipline, clarity, service, and distance from chaos. Insiders whisper that Duchy of Cornwall advisors were quietly drawn into the discussion, not as loud political actors, but as William's fine-print shield, the people capable of turning unease into procedure and emotion into documentation. Their presence suggested that this was no longer a family disagreement. It was becoming a review of boundaries, a reckoning over authority, a silent legal and symbolic counterweight to Camilla's domestic office. The deeper William looked, the more he reportedly began to view the decision not as an isolated courtesy, but as part of a broader pattern of influence during Charles's weakened period, a time when the king's attention was divided and the monarchy's internal guardrails mattered more than ever. That was what made aides nervous. William was not ranting. He was measuring. He was connecting one decision to another, one exception to a possible future, one guest list to the shape of the crown after Charles. And in that icy silence, the moral line of the conflict hardened into a phrase that seemed to echo through the palace: the firm before the family. Yet William was not the only one watching the palace doors, because Princess Anne had already sensed the danger before anyone dared say it aloud. Anne's reaction, according to those familiar with the old guard, was not surprise. It was recognition. She had seen this kind of soft intrusion before: the friendly invitation, the private exception, the harmless courtesy that slowly becomes precedent. And if William was furious because of the future, Anne was furious because of the past. Elizabeth's rules, Elizabeth's discipline, Elizabeth's crown. Reports suggest Anne viewed Camilla's decision not as a simple act of family kindness, but as a direct challenge to the unwritten code Queen Elizabeth had guarded for 70 years. Royal access is not decoration, and proximity to power is never the same as service to the nation. To Anne, the crown was not a drawing room where personal circles could drift closer whenever emotions demanded it. It was a sacred trust, built on duty, restraint, and the hard truth that privilege without sacrifice eventually poisons the institution from within. That is why her response was said to be immediate, controlled, and utterly unforgiving. She reportedly began pressing for an internal review of household invitations, access routes, family room permissions, and ceremonial seating, not because she wanted drama, but because she knew drama begins when no one checks the paperwork. Among uneasy aides, her move quietly gained a name: the Anne Audit. It sounded clinical, almost dull, but inside the palace it carried the weight of a warning. Every courtesy would be examined, every exception would be questioned, every soft approval would be pulled into the light and measured against the old standards. Anne's fury, insiders whispered, was not personal hatred for Camilla. It was something far more dangerous: protective rage. She believed the monarchy could survive scandal, grief, even illness. But it could not survive dilution, could not survive the slow transformation of royal duty into private advantage. And once she quietly aligned with William, the palace felt the shift. This was no longer one angry heir reacting to one uncomfortable decision. It was the beginning of a hard internal front, with William guarding the future and Anne guarding the past, both staring at the same line and refusing to let it be crossed. Prince Edward was reportedly mentioned in quiet corners as the guardian of the fine print, the steady figure who understood how old rules, old documents, and quiet procedures could become stronger than any public statement. His possible involvement gave the counteraction a legal and protocol edge, turning Anne's instinct into something sharper, more structured, more difficult for Camilla's domestic office to dismiss. The conflict, then, became bigger than personalities. It became a battle between Camilla's private circle and the crown's institutional spine, between emotional inclusion and earned position, between a modern family impulse and an ancient royal boundary. And Anne, iron-willed and unmoved by soft explanations, seemed determined to prove that the monarchy does not bend simply because someone close to the throne wants the room rearranged. But Anne's intervention did not merely challenge Camilla's decision, it exposed how deeply that decision had already unsettled the palace machine. Once Anne began asking questions, the atmosphere reportedly changed overnight. Aides who had stayed silent started checking old files. Protocol officers revisited guest lists. Security staff reviewed access logs. What had been described as a family courtesy suddenly looked like a paper trail. And every signature, every forwarded memo, every quiet approval became part of a larger and more devastating question. How had Camilla's decision moved so smoothly through the palace without the heir being fully consulted, and who had allowed a private household preference to drift so close to royal precedent? Reports suggest administrative staff began retracing the route of the approval, following it through offices, informal requests, and soft internal language that made the arrangement sound less serious than William. And Anne believed it truly was. The more they looked, the more uneasy the palace became. Because in royal life, danger does not always arrive with scandalous headlines. Sometimes it arrives as a calendar note, a revised seating plan, a discreet invitation, a name added to a protected list. Questions then began circling around Charles himself. Had the king personally approved the arrangement, understanding its full symbolic weight, or had it slipped forward while he was exhausted, distracted, surrounded by the pressures of illness, marriage, and monarchy? That uncertainty was explosive. No one wanted to accuse the king of weakness, but no one could ignore that a fragile reign creates openings others may not even realize they are using. William's team reportedly examined what the decision could mean for future events involving George, Charlotte, and Louis, because every royal child is not merely a child inside this institution. Each represents a future chapter of the crown. If private, relatives could be placed too near the center, even gently, even warmly, then the public message could become confused. Anne's circle, meanwhile, was said to be comparing the move against the old protocols shaped during Queen Elizabeth's reign, when access was guarded with almost severe discipline. Camilla's allies reportedly pushed back, arguing that the monarchy had to become more human, more blended, more reflective of real family life. To them, this was modernization, not manipulation. But William and Anne saw the same act through a colder lens. They believed modernization without boundaries becomes erosion, and erosion, left unchecked, becomes collapse. The tension spread across Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, and the Princess Royal's loyalists, like a silent electrical current. Staff began choosing words carefully. Courtiers stopped treating the matter as gossip. Every room seemed to understand that something larger had begun. What started as emotional fury had now become bureaucratic warfare, the kind of conflict the monarchy knows best because it leaves no fingerprints until the final door closes. And then came the moment Camilla's supporters feared most: the old documents, the old rules, and the old queen's shadow returned to the center of the fight. There are moments inside the monarchy when the dead seem more powerful than the living. This, insiders suggest, was one of them. Queen Elizabeth II was no longer there to speak, but her rules remained everywhere. In the red boxes, the letters patent, the seating charts, the rhythms of service, and the brutal understanding that the crown was never a private inheritance to be rearranged. For Anne, that legacy was not sentimental memory, it was instruction. Reports suggest she invoked the late Queen's standards not as nostalgia, but as the moral foundation of her objections, reminding those around her that Elizabeth had spent a lifetime separating service from status, bloodline from behavior, and personal affection from institutional duty. In Anne's world, the palace was not protected by emotion, it was protected by restraint, and that was why Camilla's decision struck such a deep nerve. It seemed, to Anne and William, to press against the very boundary Elizabeth had guarded most fiercely. That royal privilege must be earned through service, not softened into private access because someone stood close to the sovereign. William reportedly saw Elizabeth's legacy through the eyes of a father as much as an heir. For him, those old rules were not dusty traditions. They were shields around George, Charlotte, and Louis, safeguards ensuring that the future line of the crown would not be crowded, confused, or quietly diminished by family politics. The red box became the perfect symbol of that struggle, not because it was dramatic, but because it represented everything the monarchy depends upon: paperwork, discipline, silence, order, and decisions made for the nation rather than the comfort of one household. Older courtiers, insiders whisper, began leaning emotionally toward Anne because they remembered how Elizabeth operated. They remembered the controlled distance, the careful seating, the refusal to let warmth become weakness. They remembered that behind her smile was an iron understanding of monarchy's price. Camilla's camp may have felt wounded by this, even unfairly isolated, arguing that after years beside Charles, she deserved trust, inclusion, and space for her own family and life she had helped him carry. But that argument only sharpened the divide, because the palace was no longer debating kindness. It was debating philosophy, personal loyalty versus institutional duty, a modern family instinct versus an ancient covenant. Camilla's supporters saw exclusion, William and Anne saw protection. And as those two interpretations hardened, the atmosphere grew colder, almost solemn, as if the monarchy itself had been pulled into judgment by the woman who had defined it for 7 decades. Anne and William now understood that objections were no longer enough. A warning could be ignored. A complaint could be softened. But a counteroffensive, built on old rules and present authority, could freeze Camilla's decision before it became precedent. But the true shock came when William and Anne stopped merely objecting and began moving as one force. The counterstrike did not arrive as a shout. It arrived as paperwork. According to palace whispers, William and Anne moved with the cold precision of people who understood that royal wars are rarely won in drawing rooms. They are won through access lists, protocol reviews, security approvals, ceremonial precedents, and the quiet removal of names from rooms they were never meant to enter. By then, the alliance between the heir and the Princess Royal had reportedly gained its own private name among nervous aides, the Heirs' Accord. It was not a formal declaration, not something printed for public consumption, but inside the palace it carried the force of a line being drawn. The accord, insiders suggest, was designed to freeze Camilla's expanded access arrangement before it hardened into custom. Because in royal life, custom can become almost impossible to reverse once people begin treating it as normal. Guest lists were reviewed with a colder eye. Private privileges were questioned. Future invitations were placed under stricter control, especially those tied to legacy events where rank, duty, and bloodline carried. meaning far beyond social comfort. Anne reportedly demanded that any occasion linked to royal memory, royal property, or royal succession remain limited to working royals and direct heirs, because she believed the monarchy could not afford confusion at its most symbolic moments. William, meanwhile, was said to be immovable on one point. George, Charlotte, and Louis must never be overshadowed by private family politics. Their place in the royal story had to remain clear, protected, and untouched. By the emotional bargaining of adults around them. That insistence gave the counterstrike its emotional force. It was not merely about Camilla. It was about the next reign, the next generation, and the public trust William knew he would one day inherit. Charles was then forced into the most uncomfortable position of all, caught between wife, son, and sister, each representing a different pressure on his weakened reign. Camilla may have expected understanding. William demanded boundaries. Anne demanded discipline. And Charles, already carrying the strain of illness and kingship, was reportedly left facing a truth no monarch wants to confront. Love inside the family can become a liability when it touches the machinery of the crown. As the reviews tightened, Camilla's decision began to backfire. What may have been intended as inclusion now made her appear politically exposed, as though her domestic office had reached too far at the wrong time and awakened the very guardians she could least afford to provoke. The old guard, quietly but unmistakably, began signaling that the party was over. The monarchy would not be softened into a family business. Access would not be treated as a gift. And the crown, however fragile its current sovereign might seem, still had defenders willing to protect it with ruthless silence, exact procedure, and the unforgiving power of the fine print. But even as Camilla's plan began to collapse, the emotional cost inside the royal family was only beginning to surface. By the time the dust settled, the palace had changed, not publicly, not with a statement, not with a dramatic announcement from the gates, but inside the rooms where power actually moves. A new order had taken shape. William was no longer waiting politely. Anne was no longer merely advising, and Camilla had discovered that one palace decision could awaken an entire dynasty. Reports suggest the outcome was not a public humiliation, because the monarchy rarely exposes its deepest wounds to the outside world. Instead, it was something quieter and, in many ways, more devastating. Camilla's decision was restrained, reviewed, weakened, not necessarily torn apart in front of everyone, but drained of the authority it once appeared to carry. The access she had allegedly tried to expand was now watched more closely, questioned more sharply, and placed beneath the kind of scrutiny that turns privilege into risk. Charles, exhausted and torn, reportedly found himself unable to ignore the strength of the guardians standing before him. On one side was his wife, seeking space for her own circle inside a reign already heavy with personal sacrifice. On the other stood his son and his sister, both warning that the crown could not afford softness where legacy was concerned. And in that impossible divide, Charles seemed to face the painful truth of monarchy itself. Love may comfort a king, but duty must govern him. For William, the moment became a turning point. He was number longer simply the patient heir waiting for history to arrive. He had learned that damage must be stopped before it becomes tradition, and that the future of George, Charlotte, and Louis could not be protected by silence alone. Their place in the royal order, once threatened by confusion and private influence, was quietly reaffirmed as central to the survival of the monarchy. Anne, meanwhile, emerged as the guardian of Elizabeth's final order, the iron-willed sentinel standing between the crown and any force that might dilute it. She did not need applause. She did not need a public victory. Her triumph was in the tightening of the rules, the restoration of boundaries, and the message sent through every corridor that royal duty is not a favor to be handed out. Camilla, left more isolated than before, had discovered that influence inside the palace can become fragile the moment the system begins questioning it. What she may have viewed as inclusion had been judged by others as overreach, and the very machinery she tried to influence had turned back toward her with cold precision. In the end, the moral was impossible to miss. The crown is a sacred trust held for the nation, not a private household prize. And in the silence that followed, one truth became impossible to ignore. Duty had not shouted, but it had won. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.